The Devil's Violinist, Part 1. Chapter 1. The Last Performance. Rain drizzled down the cracked windows of the Marrow Street Playhouse, blurring the view of the empty streets outside. Inside, the peeling red velvet curtains trembled slightly in the draft, as if shivering. A handful of audience members, 12, maybe 13, scattered through the ancient theater seats like forgotten ghosts. Most were elderly. One was asleep. Another stared at the floor as if regretting ever walking in. Backstage, Lucien Marlowe tightened the worn bowstring of his violin, its wood dulled by years of use. His hands were steady, but inside he was hollow, like the violin itself, resonating with nothing but the echo of failure. This would be his last performance. He'd already decided. The city had no place for faded prodigies. Talent didn't matter if you couldn't sell it. And Lucien had sold everything: his books, his piano, his grandmother's brooch, to rent a cold attic room and keep playing shows no one came to. The posters promising Lucien Marlowe, romantic violinist extraordinaire, hung limp in the lobby, smeared with water stains and time. 2 minutes, barked the stage manager, not unkindly. Her tone held the same exhausted pity that followed him everywhere lately. Lucien nodded, lifted the violin to his shoulder, and stepped into the light. The spotlight blinked once before it steadied, bathing him in a pale, sickly glow. The audience did not applaud. They barely looked up. He played. Not for them, not anymore. Not for critics or family or the ghosts of greater musicians whispering from museum busts. He played for silence. For memory. For the version of himself that once believed music could carve a path through the world. The piece he chose was Chaconne in G minor, slow, aching, ancient. His bow danced, pulling trembling sorrow from the strings. The violin moaned, not beautifully, but truthfully. Lucien closed his eyes. When he opened them again, something strange happened. A woman in the third row was crying silently, yes, but tears were running down her cheeks. A man beside her reached for her hand. Even the dozing old man in the back sat upright, his gaze fixed on Lucien like he was the only thing keeping the dark away. By the time the final note faded, the theater was silent. Deeply, reverently silent. Then, softly, applause. Not thunderous. Not wild, but real, from a handful of strangers. And it stunned Lucien more than any standing ovation could have. He bowed, confused, moved, and left the stage with tears of his own threatening. Back in the dressing room, he sat staring at his hands, wondering if maybe this wasn't the end after all. That's when he noticed the violin case on the table. It wasn't his. His own battered case lay on the floor, scuffed and gray. This one was black, glossy, elegant, with silver clasps and a strange symbol carved into the lid, a spiral swallowing a single eye. Tucked under its handle was a handwritten card. For the concert that deserves to be remembered. L. Lucien blinked. The case was cool to the touch. Inside, nestled on deep crimson velvet, was a violin unlike any he'd seen. Its body shimmered like aged wine under candlelight, the grain of the wood tight and flawless. Its strings looked alive, silken, breathing. He stared. A gift? A prank? But as his fingers touched the instrument, the chill that traveled through him was not fear. It was anticipation. And outside, the rain began to fall harder. Chapter 2. A Stranger in Velvet. Lucien Marlowe sat in silence, staring at the violin in the black case like it might blink. The dressing room smelled of dust, mothballs, and dying roses from a bouquet left weeks ago by a distant aunt who thought he still had a career. The weak yellow light above the mirror buzzed with a soft electric whine. Outside, the faint rumble of thunder rolled through the city like a warning. He reached out, hesitating only a moment before lifting the violin. It was light, far lighter than it should have been for its size. The wood was so smooth, it felt like glass beneath his fingertips. And warm. Almost too warm. As he brought it to his chin and touched the bow to the strings, he felt a sudden tightness in the room, like the air had thickened. But he played. Just one note. It rang out impossibly clear, cutting through the stale air like the first gasp of spring after a long, bitter winter. The sound shimmered. It lingered. It breathed. Lucien pulled the bow away, startled. The room was too quiet now. Even the old pipes above had gone silent. A knock came at the dressing room door. Startled, he set the violin down gently, reverently, and opened it. The man who stood outside was dressed in a dark velvet coat that brushed the floor, tailored with a precision not seen in modern fashion. His silver hair was slicked back, his face lean and angular, like it had been carved from alabaster. His smile was sharp, precise, empty of warmth, yet filled with interest. "Mr. Marlowe," he said, his voice a smooth whisper, like silk dragging over a blade. "You played beautifully tonight." Lucien hesitated. "Thank you. Do I know you?" "Not yet, but I've been watching you perform for some time." Lucien raised an eyebrow. "You one of the 3 people in the audience?" The man's smile widened just a touch. "I'm not one for crowds." He stepped inside uninvited, his presence soaking into the small room like perfume or smoke. Lucien shut the door behind him, wary but curious. "You left this?" Lucien asked, nodding toward the black case. "I merely returned what was owed." He walked to the violin and gazed down at it with something like reverence. "The Tempest. A rare piece. Its sound, unlike any other. It seeks a worthy hand." Lucien studied him, unsettled. "And who are you?" The man didn't answer immediately. He reached into his coat and drew out a thin card, placing it on the table next to the violin. Lucien picked it up. There was no name, only an address. 71, Ashcroft Lane. By appointment. Ask for Lorne. "I don't understand," Lucien said. "Is this a gift? A loan? A test?" Lorne's gaze flicked to him. "All 3, perhaps. Consider it an invitation." "To what?" "To be heard," Lorne said. "Truly heard." Lucien wanted to scoff, but the man's tone halted him. It was the way he said it, like he wasn't offering applause or fame, but immortality. Lorne turned to leave. At the door, he paused. "Play it, Mr. Marlowe, and listen carefully. You may find the world begins to listen back." Then he was gone. Lucien stood alone in the quiet room, the rain tapping now against the dressing room windows like soft fingers. He looked at the address again. 71, Ashcroft Lane. He'd never heard of it. He sat down, picked up the violin, and drew the bow across the strings once more. The note that followed was beautiful, ethereal, unnatural. Somewhere far away, a window shattered, and Lucien smiled for the first time in weeks. Chapter 3. The First Note. That night, Lucien couldn't sleep. He lay in his narrow bed beneath the sloped ceiling of his attic apartment, staring up at the faint cracks in the plaster, lit dimly by the city's sickly orange glow bleeding through the single curtainless window. His fingers itched. His mind hummed, not with anxiety, but anticipation. The black violin case sat at the foot of his bed like an animal watching him, silent and waiting. He gave in. Lucien rose, bare feet cold against the wooden floor, and carried the case reverently to the small space by his window, the only area in the flat large enough to stand and play without knocking into stacks of sheet music or empty coffee tins. He sat on the stool he'd inherited from his first teacher, cracked at the joints and speckled with rosin dust. The city outside was quiet, the rain now a soft mist. A faint fog curled through the alleyways like something alive. Lucien opened the case. The violin lay cradled in red velvet, gleaming as though it had never known time or dust. He touched its neck with reverent fingers, feeling again that faint warmth, the heat of something recently alive. The strings shimmered, catching light that wasn't there. He lifted it. The chin rest molded itself against his skin like it belonged there. The balance was perfect. Almost too perfect. Lucien had played dozens of violins in his life, some worth more than his entire building, but none had ever felt so natural, so responsive, so aware. He didn't choose a specific piece. His hands moved without thought, conjuring an original melody, slow, searching, minor key, drenched in melancholy. The sound that emerged was not human. It was beautiful, devastating. Every note was a confession, a sigh, a prayer for something lost. The tone was deep and lush, but there was a shimmer beneath it, an almost vocal undertone that wove through the music like a second voice. It was as if the violin itself was harmonizing, breathing, mourning with him. Lucien's eyes widened. The air in the room had changed. Warmer, closer. The shadows clung to the corners like thick oil. The world outside faded. Only the music remained. He kept playing. His fingers moved faster. He poured himself into the instrument, his fears, his frustrations, his grief at a world that had stopped listening. The violin answered with a sound so rich and painful it brought tears to his eyes. And then a whisper. Lucien stopped. The whisper wasn't in the room. It wasn't outside. It was inside the note. A breath hidden between vibrations. A voice, speaking in a tongue that twisted and crumbled as soon as he tried to remember it. The silence that followed was too heavy, too deliberate. Lucien lowered the bell. The apartment seemed to exhale around him. He stood, rattled, his heart pounding with a strange exhilaration. He laughed, a short, breathless thing. "You're not normal," he whispered to the violin, still cradled in his arms. "You're bloody unreal." As he returned it to the velvet-lined case, he noticed something. The strings were no longer translucent. They were red. Faintly so, but unmistakably red, like fine thread soaked in rust or blood. He blinked, rubbed his eyes. They were normal again. Had they changed? Or had he imagined it? He latched the case shut, suddenly uneasy. The apartment seemed colder now. But then he noticed something else. The ache in his hands was gone. The stiffness in his wrist, the tendinitis from years of overuse, had disappeared. He flexed his fingers. No pain. No resistance. A quiet thrill crept up his spine. He slept at night with the violin case beside his bed, one hand resting atop it like a knight with his sword. Morning came sharp and gray. Lucien descended the apartment stairs to fetch the mail. The hallway smelled of mold and boiled cabbage. He flipped through the usual stack of bills and notices until a red envelope stopped him cold. No return address. Inside, a single card. "You're invited to perform this evening. Whitestone Manor. 8 p.m. sharp." No signature. No RSVP. Lucien stared. He'd heard of Whitestone, a decaying estate on the city's edge, once a music conservatory, now privately owned by a reclusive patron of the arts. No one got invited to perform at Whitestone unless you were somebody. And Lucien Marlowe was nobody. Until now. He looked down at the violin case in his hand. The silver clasps glinted. And somewhere deep in the back of his mind, a faint voice whispered. Play. Chapter 4. Applause and Ambulances. Whitestone Manor stood like a forgotten cathedral at the edge of the city, tall, brooding, and wrapped in ivy so thick it seemed the earth itself was trying to reclaim it. The wrought iron gates groaned open as Lucien approached, violin case in hand, a lone lantern flickering above the threshold. His taxi had driven away the moment he stepped out, tires squealing. The driver hadn't waited for a tip. Lucien climbed the steps to the arched wooden doors, where a butler, tall, thin, and almost corpse-pale, opened the door without a word. The entrance hall swallowed Lucien whole. The scent of old wood, candle wax, and something faintly metallic lingered in the air. A quartet of guests sipped from crystal flutes near the fireplace in the adjoining room, their silk and velvet attire untouched by time or dust. Their smiles were thin, eyes curious, watching him too closely. "You're the musician," said a woman with white gloves that reached her elbows. Her voice was as smooth as melted sugar, but Lucien detected the faintest tremor underneath. "I suppose I am," Lucien said, offering a tight smile. "I wasn't given much context." "That's how our host prefers it," she replied. "He likes to surprise his guests." A steward led Lucien to the music room, where a stage had been arranged, a velvet chair under a golden chandelier, and an antique music stand placed before it. The walls were lined with oil portraits, composers, mostly, and one or two unsmiling women in black lace. Their eyes followed him. 10 minutes, the steward whispered, vanishing into the shadows. Lucien sat and opened the violin case. The instrument was flawless as ever, as if it had just been carved by divine hands. He ran his thumb along the curve of its body, then tuned it slowly. Precisely. He hadn't chosen a piece. He didn't need to. The violin would tell him what to play. The audience filtered in only 15 or so. Wealthy. Old. The kind who'd long since stopped clapping unless moved by ghosts. They sat in silence, the candlelight flickering in their eyes. Lucien lifted the violin to his shoulder and took a breath. Then he began. The first note floated through the room like breath made of silk. The second was darker, deep, resonant, a slow burn that pulled every ear toward him. He wasn't playing the music. It was playing through him. The violin surged and swayed, telling a story he didn't know he knew. It was mourning and longing and ecstasy twisted into a single, unbroken line. Each bow stroke was like opening a vein. Each pause was a gasp between heartbeats. As he reached the middle of the piece, Lucien noticed something strange. The audience had changed. Their posture had softened. Their expressions had collapsed inward. One man sat rigid, tears streaming silently down his face. A woman clutched her chest, not in pain, but in awe. Reverence. The room grew heavier with every measure. Lucien's fingers danced. The violin sang. And then, as the final note rang out and faded into silence, he heard it. A thud. A soft, slumping sound from the third row. A woman had collapsed forward in her chair, her pearls dangling loosely over her lap. Her glass fell from her hand, scattering crimson wine across the rug. Gasps filled the room. Someone screamed. A man shouted, "Call an ambulance." Lucien froze. He rose, instinctively stepping down from the stage, but no one looked at him. They surged around the fallen woman, calling her name, checking her pulse. "She's not breathing," someone whispered. Lucien's hands trembled. He turned back toward the stage, toward the violin in his hand, and dropped it. It didn't hit the ground. It hovered for the briefest second before landing gently against the floor like a feather, silent, unharmed. The doors burst open as paramedics rushed in, their boots echoing against the polished marble. Lucien backed away, slipping through the hallway and out the manor doors before anyone could ask questions. The night air outside hit him like a slap. He stood alone beneath the towering front gate, watching the flashing red and blue lights reflect in the windows of the manor behind him. The violin case in his hand felt heavier than before. Inside, the strings hummed, just once, like they were satisfied. Chapter 5. The Rising Cadence. Lucien sat alone in his apartment as the sun bled through the curtains like an open wound. He hadn't slept. The violin case sat closed on the table, its silver clasps glinting in the shifting light like eyes that blinked only when you looked away. His tea had gone cold. His fingers wouldn't stop twitching. The sound of the woman falling at Whitestone Manor echoed over and over in his memory. The moment the final note ended. The drop. The sudden silence. And yet, there had been applause. Short, polite, but unmistakable. Applause, even as paramedics pushed through the doors and wrapped the woman's body in white. Lucien had fled, not out of guilt, but confusion. He hadn't killed her. She was old, fragile. It could have been coincidence. The music had moved her. That's all. It was tragic, but not supernatural. Right? Still, he hadn't picked up the violin since. He glanced at the case. It hadn't moved. It never moved. But something about it felt closer now. The kind of closeness that made the back of his neck itch. Lucien rose, paced, sat again. He ran his hands through his hair, then opened his phone. No news articles. No headlines. No investigation. Just a private email from a name he didn't recognize. From cordelia.grove@whitestonefoundation.org. Subject: Thank you for last night. Your music gave my mother peace. Her heart had been failing for years. I believe your performance allowed her to pass gently. I am grateful. Cordelia Grove. Lucien stared at the screen. She was thanking him? The lines on the email blurred. Something sharp and cold slid down his spine. Not fear. Something darker. Satisfaction. He stood, suddenly needing air, and threw on his coat. The invitations came quickly after that. First from a private gallery in Old Town. Then from a boutique hotel that hosted intimate classical nights. Then a wealthy couple requesting a private salon performance for their anniversary. And then, the cathedral at Duskwell. An abandoned church turned into a music hall for the elite, rumored to have once hosted Paganini himself. The venue's director sent an urgent message: "We hear your name everywhere." Lucien hadn't told anyone he performed at Whitestone. No one had filmed it. He hadn't posted. And yet, his name was traveling. He told himself it was a fluke. Word of mouth. Rich people talking. They loved stories. A violinist with tragic eyes and haunting music was good gossip. But deep down, Lucien knew it was the sound. The way the violin pulled emotion from the air like a spider spinning silk. At the gallery performance, it happened again. Halfway through his second piece, a man in the back collapsed. This time, there was no scream, only a hush that fell over the crowd as people slowly turned toward the fallen guest. Lucien kept playing. He told himself he hadn't seen it, that it was none of his concern. He ended the piece on a perfect, sustained note that hung in the air like the final breath of something sacred. The audience stood in reverent silence. Then they applauded. Louder this time. Longer. Afterward, people approached him like he was holy. A woman whispered, "You made me feel like I was dying, and I didn't want it to stop." Another said, "I saw my husband. He's been gone 5 years." Lucien thanked them all with hollow politeness. Inside, he felt like something was rooting itself in his chest. Twisting. He returned home that night with a check in his coat pocket and a headache that felt like something crawling behind his eyes. He opened the violin case just to look. Inside, nestled beside the instrument, was something new. A single black rose, its petals edged in red, as if burned. No note, no explanation, just the slow realization that something was watching his ascent and smiling. Chapter 6. The Widow's Letter. The envelope was thick, cream-colored, and sealed with red wax. Lucien found it that morning, slid under his door, as if placed there by hand. No postage, no handwriting on the front. Only his name. Lucien Marlowe, written in flawless, old-fashioned cursive. He turned it over. The wax seal bore a symbol he'd seen once before, on the case of the black violin, a spiral swallowing a single eye. This time, he didn't pretend not to recognize it. He opened it. Dear Mr. Marlowe, my name is Evelyn Ambrose. I was present at your performance at the Old Town Gallery 2 nights ago. I was the woman in the green velvet shawl who wept during your final piece. I doubt you noticed me, as your music had taken you elsewhere, somewhere only true artists go. I wanted to thank you. My husband, Franklin, was the gentleman who passed during your performance. He had been gravely ill for months. We kept it quiet. We didn't want pity. He had refused hospitals, refused morphine, refused to die in a room that smelled of disinfectant. That night, when you played, something changed. I could see it in his eyes. He wasn't afraid. He was listening with his whole soul. I held his hand until the end. He smiled. He let go. There was no fear. No struggle. I don't know if you believe in such things, but I believe your music freed him. Thank you, Mr. Marlowe. I don't know what gift you've been given, but please, keep playing. There are many who need what you offer. Sincerely, Evelyn Ambrose. Lucien read it 3 times. Each time, a different part of him reacted. The first time, he felt disbelief. The second, shame. The third, a warm, golden pulse of pride. He had given the man peace. The music had made death bearable. No, beautiful. That mattered, didn't it? He folded the letter carefully and placed it in the violin case beside the black rose, which had not withered despite the passing days. Its petals still curled like fingers waiting to close. That afternoon, he received 2 more invitations. He didn't decline either. Lucien stood before a private audience in the drawing room of a politician's estate, old money, marble floors, portraits of men with powdered wigs and powdered consciences. The guests were eager, buzzing with wine and whispers of the deaf violinist, though no one dared use the phrase aloud. He played again. This time, he chose to watch the audience as he performed. Their faces were transformed, eyes shining, cheeks flushed, hands clasped as though in prayer. One woman knelt slowly to the floor as if overwhelmed. A man closed his eyes and mouthed something, tears streaking down his temples. Lucien played, and something listened through him. The violin knew where to go, when to pierce, when to soothe, when to break the heart, and when to bleed it dry. The final note struck like a funeral bell. No one died that time. But the host, an aging patriarch who'd spent the night clutching his chest, approached Lucien after the concert and whispered, "If that's how it feels to go, I'm ready." Lucien left before dessert. Back in his apartment, Lucien stared at the letter again. He reread Evelyn's words, now underlined in his mind by the eyes of the man who welcomed death. He tried not to think of the growing hunger in his chest, the strange sense of purpose. But he couldn't ignore what he felt. The music was changing people. It was changing him. He placed the violin on the stand in the center of the room. As he stepped back, he saw his reflection in the dark glass of the window. Except it didn't move when he did. He blinked. The reflection adjusted. A trick of the light, surely. Fatigue. Still, he turned the mirror to face the wall before going to bed. Just in case. Chapter 7. Crescendo. Rain lashed against the rooftop like 1,000 frantic fingers. The city outside Lucien's attic window was awash in golds and grays, hazy halos of lamplight swirling through the fog. Inside, the air buzzed with tension. The violin sat on its stand in the middle of the room, not in its case. Lucien hadn't been able to put it away since the performance at the politician's estate. It sat like a deity waiting to be worshipped, and he couldn't stop circling it. His thoughts felt like a string pulled too tight. All day, he drifted between fits of silence and bursts of manic playing. He hadn't eaten, barely slept. The violin demanded more than practice, it demanded presence. He gave it both. It had been 4 days since his last performance, and invitations were piling up. Private salons, music festivals, even a midnight concert in a deconsecrated cathedral that claimed to host only the rarest talents. His name was traveling like wildfire. No agent, no publicist, no explanation. But it wasn't fame that consumed him. It was the sound. Each time he played, the music grew clearer, more alive. He began to hear harmony where none existed. Undertones beneath every note, faint voices in the resonance, like distant choirs singing behind the strings. And something else. A low hum, like the violin was breathing. That night, Lucien received a call from a concert director named Morel. She was sharp-tongued, impatient, and well-connected. "You've been summoned to play at the Moorgrave Society," she said. "They only host 2 events a year. If they like you, you're made." Lucien had heard of the Moorgrave. They were tastemakers. Wealthy, ruthless, and invisible. Their favor could resurrect a career or bury it in silence. He accepted without hesitation. The concert hall was tucked into the side of an ancient manor surrounded by a gated courtyard and hedges trimmed like funeral sculptures. No signs. No advertisements. Just an invitation delivered by hand. Inside, the ceilings were vaulted and painted with scenes of mythic suffering: Orpheus flayed, Pan weeping over a broken reed, angels screaming into violins. The audience was silent. Dozens of them, dressed in black. All eyes on him. He stepped onto the stage and took his place in the spotlight. The violin pulsed in his hand. Lucien played. He let the music guide him. He didn't choose the notes. They rose from the strings as if the instrument had learned how to speak. The melody twisted and shimmered, at once glorious and terrifying. Some in the audience clutched the seats in front of them. Others wept openly. One man collapsed, seizing, eyes rolled back, mouth open in ecstasy or agony. No one moved to help him. Lucien didn't stop. His fingers bled across the strings, but he didn't feel the pain. Only the crescendo. And when the final note exploded like a dying star and silence fell like a hammer, no one applauded. They only stood, as if in mourning, or reverence. Afterward, as he staggered off stage, sweat-soaked and shaking, he found a letter waiting for him in his dressing room. No envelope. Just folded parchment. It read, "You are awakening. Keep playing. L." Lucien's throat went dry. He hadn't seen Lorne since the night at the Marrow Street Playhouse. He looked around the room, half expecting to see that velvet coat and hollow smile. But the hallway was empty. He sat down, trembling. On the table beside the note was a gift box, black, lacquered, wrapped in ribbon made of something that looked disturbingly like hair. He opened it. Inside was a fresh set of strings. Red. Alive. They pulsed once, just once, against his fingers. Later that night, Lucien restrung the violin. And from the alley outside, someone watching the attic window whispered, "He's ready." Chapter 8. The Composer's Manuscript. It was nearly dawn when Lucien noticed the lining. He'd just finished restringing the violin with the crimson threads, still unsure whether they were made of gut, silk, or something else entirely, and was gently wiping the body of the instrument with a cloth when he noticed a faint seam inside the case. It hadn't been there before. At first, he thought it was just a crease in the velvet. But when he ran his fingers across it, the cloth gave slightly, as if concealing a pocket. With shaking hands, he worked the edge open. His fingers slid beneath the velvet, and something dry and stiff brushed against his skin. He pulled it free, a tightly rolled scroll of parchment, tied with a black ribbon. No name. No seal. He sat down at his desk, unfurled it slowly, and froze. The pages were filled with musical notation, but not in any style Lucien recognized. The notes were arranged in concentric spirals rather than staves, surrounded by glyphs and markings that looked more like incantations than anything from a composer's pen. At the top of the first page, scrawled in spidery ink, were 3 Latin words. Musica mortuorum cantata. The cantata of the dead. Lucien's breath caught. The manuscript was old, very old. The ink had browned, and the edges were flaking. But the markings were deliberate, obsessive. Some passages had been rewritten 3-4 times. In the margins, someone had scribbled feverish annotations in multiple languages: Latin, French, German, something unrecognizable. One phrase repeated again and again. Each note is a nail. Each silence, a grave. A chill slid across his shoulders. He scanned deeper into the document. Amidst the sprawling glyphs and sigils, one symbol appeared again and again. A violin surrounded by flames, pierced through the cinder with a vertical line, almost like a sword. Underneath it, the spiral and eye. The same symbol on the case. Lucien's hands trembled. He turned the page. On the final sheet was a name, barely legible, written in blood-colored ink. Gasparo Vanetti, Venice, 1714. The name rang a bell. Lucien hurried to his bookshelf, pulling down a heavy tome of musical biographies, his lifeline in his conservatory years. He flipped through the fragile pages until he found it. Gasparo Vanetti, an obscure Italian composer from the early 18th century. Known for only one surviving piece, an unfinished violin sonata that drove its only performer to madness. Vanetti disappeared before the piece was ever debuted. Rumors swirled that he had created a death requiem, music so powerful it could part the veil between life and death. His final work was titled La Sinfonia del Silenzio Infinito, the Symphony of Endless Silence. Lucien looked up at the parchment. It matched Vanetti's handwriting exactly. The violin on the stand pulsed faintly in the morning gloom. Later that day, Lucien brought the manuscript to someone he trusted, Madeleine Cross, an old friend and scholar of arcane musicology at a nearby university. She was one of the few who might understand what he'd found. They met in her cramped office, lined wall-to-wall with scores, books, and instruments in various stages of disrepair. Lucien laid the manuscript on her desk. Her eyes widened. "Where did you get this?" she asked, voice hushed. "I found it," he said. Madeleine began flipping through the pages, her fingertips trembling. "This shouldn't exist. I've heard rumors, but I always thought it was myth. A cursed sonata. They say it was written in mourning after Vanetti lost his wife and child to plague." Lucien leaned forward. "What happened to him? No one knows. But there are whispers, old, hidden things. That he didn't just write the music to honor the dead, he wrote it for them." She looked up at him, something wary in her eyes. "They say he sold his soul in exchange for an instrument that could channel death itself." Lucien's mouth went dry. "And the violin?" Madeleine hesitated. "I don't know. But if what you have is real, you need to be careful." He nodded, tucking the manuscript away. But the moment he left her office, Lucien noticed something chilling. As he walked past the university's music hall, every student practicing inside fell silent. Violins stilled, pianos abandoned mid-chord, even the clattering of percussion halted. They were all looking at him. Every single one. As if they'd heard something following him. That night, Lucien played the first passage from the manuscript. Just a few notes. Enough to feel the shape of it. The room shivered. The shadows lengthened. And across the city, a man in a hospital flatlined, smiling. Chapter 9. Shadows in the Balcony. The concert hall was small, but elegant, an old Baroque theater tucked into the heart of the city's forgotten quarter. It had once been a jewel of the aristocracy, known for its impeccable acoustics and gilded ceiling fresco of Apollo flaying Marsyas. Now, it smelled of damp velvet and old ghosts. Lucien stood backstage, fingers trembling slightly as he prepared. He wasn't nervous. No, this was something else, an itch at the base of his skull, as if something unseen were pressing gently against the back of his mind. Watching. Waiting. He brushed the sensation away. He couldn't afford distraction. Tonight's audience included several patrons from the Moorgrave Society, and he knew now that their favor meant more than wealth or prestige. It meant access. To places that didn't appear on maps. To knowledge hidden in black lacquered boxes. To power. Lucien stepped out onto the stage. The audience greeted him in polite silence. He set the violin beneath his chin, the blood-red strings gleaming faintly under the low lights. He didn't choose a piece. The violin did. The first note rang out like a whisper in a crypt. It slithered through the room, brushed against skin, slid behind eyelids. Lucien closed his eyes and let it guide him. The music was slow, mournful, elegant. A lullaby for dying kings. The kind of melody that made you remember your last heartbreak, your first love, and your funeral all at once. He played on. But as he approached the crescendo, a prickle of cold licked down his spine. Something had changed. He opened his eyes mid-phrase and faltered. The balcony. There were people in the upper gallery. That wasn't unusual. What was unusual was that no one had been seated up there when he began. 3 figures now stood in the darkness above. Not sat, stood. Perfectly still. Dressed in black. No faces visible. No movement. No blinking. Their presence was like a smudge in the air, wrong in shape, in silence, in shadow. Lucien's breath hitched, but he didn't stop playing. The violin demanded he continue. And as he did, more shadows joined the balcony. 5, 7, 9, all standing. all watching. None moved. None breathed. None clapped when he finished. After the performance, Lucien staggered off stage, heart thundering. He pulled aside the stage manager. Who's in the balcony? She blinked. No one. We don't seat up there. It's condemned. Unsafe flooring. Lucien froze. But I saw it. She gave him a strained smile. I think the adrenaline's getting to you, maestro. Why don't you rest? He left without replying. Outside, the city air felt colder than it should have. A mist curled along the streets, wrapping around his ankles like it wanted to hold him in place. He walked quickly. Eyes darting. Every figure in the distance looked too still. Too tall. When he finally reached the safety of his attic apartment, he didn't take off his coat. He simply stood there, staring out the window. He felt them. Not outside. Here. In the shadows behind him. He spun. Nothing. The room was empty. But the violin sat on its stand, strings faintly pulsing like a heartbeat. On the desk beside it lay the manuscript, flipped to a page he hadn't touched. The next passage was marked with a single phrase in Vanetti's ink. Those who hear you will always come. And once they come, they stay. Lucien stepped back. And in the mirror behind him, just for a second, he saw a figure standing behind his shoulder, too tall, too thin, with a face like a smear of smoke. When he turned around, it was gone. But the mirror cracked. The story may end here. But the darkness never sleeps. Like this video to keep the shadows stirring. Share your whispers in the comments. Your voice shapes the next nightmare. And subscribe to our YouTube channel, The Gothic Hour Stories and Mysteries, where every tale lingers and every soul leaves a mark. The Gothic Hour awaits.